triumphalism, but the SNP position back in 2003 was that intervention in Iraq would lead to chaos.
Well, I mean, our position in 2003 is exactly what Sir John Chilcot and his committee have now detailed, that the process of decision-making was wrong-headed, that there was no immediate need for war, that the United Nations was being subverted, and that the likelihood was that out of it would come no good whatsoever. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, we know that no good was an understatement. We've got 200,000 Iraqi dead, we've got the Middle East in flames, we're all living with the terrorist upsurge, which has been partially a result of the Iraqi intervention. So, beyond our most pessimistic expectations, Chilcot in that civil service, understated, very polite but totally damning way has laid out the case against Tony Blair and Tony Blair's government.
But we can now put, Mr. Salmond, we can now put a couple of claims to rest. Given the opportunity, he was given the opportunity to do so, but Sir John refused to describe Tony Blair as a liar. Does the former Prime Minister have a point when he suggests that, you know, the decisions that he took, decisions which he stands by, were based on the evidence, the intelligence as presented to him?
Well, it's not Sir John Chilcot's job to describe the former Prime Minister as a liar. In fact, I think Chilcot's report is greatly strengthened because this is mild man and civil service mandarin Sir John Chilcot saying these things. It's him that's saying the United Nations was undermined. It's him that's saying that war was not justified because it wasn't the last possible
Mr.
resort.
Salmond, it's also him that says that the intelligence was not falsified.
No, what John Chilcot also points out is the intelligence presentation mixed up Tony Blair's opinion with the actual intelligence, which he says should have been challenged but wasn't because of the processes of government, which had totally broken down in terms of decision-making. I mean, there's a passage in the summary, for example, which goes through a sequence of events from 2001 to when Tony Blair engaged in this dialogue with George Bush about regime change, incidentally, right through the run-up to the United Nations and the war and the lack of preparations thereafter, and comes to the conclusion that none of these decisions, and none of these absolutely critical decisions, was there any semblance of cabinet decision-making. It was all seat-of-the-pants stuff from Tony Blair and his immediate advisers.
What do we make, though, of the argument? I mean, Tony Blair, you will have watched at least some of that press conference he held this afternoon. At times he appeared to be quite emotional about the decisions that he'd made. I mean, he did say that there had been mistakes made, those mistakes being a reliance on intelligence that proved to be inaccurate and the lack of post-war planning.
Well, these are big mistakes, are they not? I mean, these are the mistakes that resulted in 179 British war dead, thousands of Americans, 200,000 Iraqis in the Middle East in flames. I mean, this is not, you know, kind of losing a game at football or losing a game at tennis. This is, you know, huge, huge stuff. I mean, I thought his press conference was totally incoherent. At one time he was saying, I take total responsibility for everything that's been done, but of course I would do it again. You know, even after everything he's learned, he said he would do it again. Which is quite remarkable. I mean, I think that the hand of history is weighing heavily in the conscience of Tony Blair.
But should the weight of responsibility rest on the shoulders of Tony Blair, given that military intervention in Iraq was largely a US affair?
Well, of course it was a US affair, but that doesn't justify the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, you know, aiding and abetting an American president. And of course this stuff about Tony Blair, I didn't deceive, I didn't mislead, that's totally not true. I mean, we've got the evidence from not so much the hand of Sir John Chilcot, but what's been published in terms of the memos. I mean, I've got one here from the 28th of July 2002, the first words of which are, this is Tony Blair to George Bush, a private memo only seen by Downing Street staff, not seen by the Cabinet, not seen by the public, not seen by Parliament, until published today. I will be with you, whatever. Now, that was at a time when he was busy. Tony Blair was telling Parliament and people, well, look, I'm trying my best to deal with the weapons of mass destruction. I'm going for the United Nations route. I'm restraining America so as we take collective action. I'm doing my best to preserve the peace. But in private, he was telling George Bush, I will be with you, whatever. And out of that, I mean, perhaps it's a satisfactory irony in many ways that the final damning indictment of Tony Blair doesn't come from the pen of Sir John Chilcot. It comes from his own words in that private memo.
But as someone who has occupied a high office as First Minister, do you not have I don't know. A degree of sympathy for someone who has, in previous occasions, relied on intelligence being passed to him by, amongst others, the Americans and MI6, looking at that evidence and making a decision based upon it.
But Chilcot's damning in this. He said there was no requirement to go to war when the decision was made, that the evidence supported that there was no immediate threat, that the diplomatic options hadn't been exhausted.
You'll have listened, Mr. Sam, you'll have listened to Anne Cloud a moment ago, who said, you know, there were plenty, there were hundreds of thousands, there were thousands of Kurds. There were thousands of Kurds who were worried about.
I don't dispute for a minute Anne Cloud's consistency in these matters. Anne has always called for regime change. Like me, she's been a campaigner for Kurdish rights over the years, but her position hasn't varied. But Tony Blair wasn't arguing for regime change. If we remember, in public, even at the last moment, he was saying Saddam Hussein could save himself if he complies and owns up to his weapons of mass destruction. In private, of course, he was telling George Bush he supported regime change. So there's a world of difference between somebody like Anne Cloud, who's a consistent record of saying this man must be removed, and Tony Blair, who said it was about weapons of mass destruction, was saying one thing in private to George Bush and another thing entirely to Parliament and people. That's why, in addition to learning lessons about the processes of government, improving things and doing all of the things that Chilcot recommends, there has to be a personal level of accountability. If we're going to make sure that such a thing doesn't happen again, because it wasn't the processes of government, committees who made decisions at the end of the day, it was Tony Blair, and there has to be accountability if we're to avoid it happening again.
Yeah, well, certainly the families are looking to investigate the possibility of legal action. We'll see what happens next. Mr. Sam, thanks very much for joining us in Sky News.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you.
Well, as we've been hearing, the Iraq inquiry has found a litany of failures in the UK's Iraq war. But Tony Blair insists the decision had to be taken. He stands by it. Well, we'll hear a little bit more from Mr. Blair in a second. First, here's what Sir John had to say.
For the inquiry were whether it was right and necessary to invade Iraq in March 2003, and whether the UK could and should have been better prepared for what followed. We have concluded that the UK chose to join the invasion of Iraq before the peaceful options for disarmament had been exhausted. Military action at that time was not a last resort. We have also concluded that the judgments about the severity of the threat posed by Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, WMD, were presented with a certainty that was not justified. Despite explicit warnings, the consequences of the invasion